Our panelists for this session are Dr. Karthik Muralidharan, Tata Chancellor, Professor of Economics, University of California; Shri Manoj Ahuja, Chief Secretary, Government of Orissa; and to deliver a keynote address, we have Shri Amitabh Kant, India's G20 Sherpa, who will be here with us. And I think they're all here and they will be joining us soon. I'd like to request everyone to settle down before we bring them in. We'd like to have the house in order. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to request all of you to please settle down. My colleagues have gone in to escort our speakers for this session. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for this session, Dr. Karthik Muralidharan, Shri Manoj Ahuja, and Mr. Amitabh Kant. They will be joining us soon. Ladies and gentlemen, do join me in welcoming Shri Amitabh Kant, India's G20 Sherpa, and Mr. Banerjee. We are awaiting, yes, both our other speakers are also joining them on the dais. Taking India forward. To begin this session, I'd like to invite Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, Director General CII, to give the opening remarks, please.
So we have in this session, which is titled as Taking India Forward Together, three individuals with whom we could have easily spent 1 hour one-to-one. But instead, we are packing 1 hour with all of them. I'll use the only couple of minutes to say what we would try to discuss and what could be the format of it. What we would try to discuss is when we say together, it is the center and the states of India. So we have Mr. Amitabh Kant, who has worn many hats over the last decades. And today, as was mentioned, India's G20 Sherpa, completely focused on international and the way he handled during India's presidency, the role of the Sherpa in navigating through many troubled waters. That's something which we are all aware of. Also with us is Mr. Manoj Ahuja, Chief Secretary of the Government of Odisha. The state's participation in this session is the critical aspect of our discussion. And so we look forward from the Chief Secretary many answers, and I'm sure he will also talk about what are the impediments of certain things that we expect but won't see happening. And we have seen him in more than a session since yesterday, Dr. Kartik Muralidharan from the University of California. He has again been a very known face to CII. So his thoughts and inputs to this subject would be critical. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that the next story of India really lies in the states of India. And India has 29 mini Indias, if one can see. It's complex. There are many challenges, many issues, yet we have to work together. We hear other parts of the globe talking about a few countries trying to work out something, mostly, in most cases, in most subjects, unsuccessfully. But in India, we have a story where we have had successes. We have successes in many of the subjects that we have. We have done very well in many of our targets and many of our visions, but we need to do more. We're talking about an India, a developed India by 2047. We are talking about a Viksit Bharat by 2047. We are talking about India being the third largest economy very soon. And we are looking at a growth rate which would be the highest growth rate for any emerging from any major economy. So given these positive sides of where our visions are and where our thoughts are, my question, the format of the session will be free-flowing discussion, questions, no keynote addresses, and no speeches. So if there has been a speech, it's just about getting over. So with that, I'll actually turn to the panelists and pose this to each one of them to begin with. To be a Viksit Bharat 2047, we have a phenomenal vision laid out here from the center. We need the states to fold in. So what's the response of each one of our panel to that as to how the role of the states in building a Viksit Bharat? I start with Mr. Amitav Kant, the G20 Sherpa.
Thank you, Chandrajit. And, first and foremost, to my mind, if India is to become a Viksit Bharat, that means taking your economy from about 4 trillion to 30 trillion by 2047. And this means that India has to, its GDP has to grow 8 times. Your per capita income has to grow 9 times. Your manufacturing has to grow 16 times between this period. Now, if this is the scale of transformation required, that is the Prime Minister's vision, then you need the states to do massive transformation. This can't be done without the states. You need at least 12 states of India to grow at 10% plus for the next 3 decades. And this cannot be done without Bihar, UP, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, all these states becoming the key drivers of growth. I'm making this point because these states account for almost about 55 to 60% of your population. And if these states transform, then India is transformed. And for that to happen, these states need to move away from agriculture. I'd gone to Chhattisgarh recently. In Chhattisgarh, 67% of your population is dependent on agriculture. And therefore, these states need a structural transformation of moving away from agriculture. India can't grow with 46% of your population dependent on agriculture, a sector which gives you only 13% of GDP. This structural transformation of states is the key. The second point I want to make is that growth comes from urbanization. Urbanization is the critical driver of growth, and India is going to see a massive urbanization, 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization. Now we have 42 cities of India which are amongst the 50 of the most polluting cities in the world. This is all states' job. Now, states are not delivering on municipal governance. There's a failure of governance on municipality. And without good municipal governance and without state focusing on good urbanization, it will be very difficult for India to achieve the Prime Minister's vision of $30 trillion. And that is the key. The third point I want to make is that we need a massive, huge, renewed vigor on scrapping rules, regulation, procedures, paperwork, laws at the state level. The government of India has focused on ease of doing business. Now the next round of revolution of scrapping rules and regulations and laws in bulk has to come from the states. I'm making this point because India can grow with free enterprise. The private sector has to make India grow. Government is not in the business of making production and industrialization. That only the private sector can do. But the government should be the catalyst and the facilitator for that. Government has to focus on this, and the role of the state is critical. Central government has done this, but the states have not done this, and the states must do this. That is my third point. And the fourth point I want to make, I think, and I'll leave it to Karthik to elucidate, is that the role of the state government should be on improving learning outcomes, health outcomes, and nutritional standards. And there a lot needs to be done on delivery. A huge improvement on these outcomes is necessary. And with these 4 points, I'll come back later. I'll conclude now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those opening remarks. If there is one person whom I would not envy to speak just now, is Mr. Manoj Ahuja, but I'll turn to him immediately. But with two specific issues that was raised by Mr. Kant. He talked about ease of regulatory framework. So is there anything which is, how can state, and your state has done some wonderful work in some of the reforms, be it in the power, even I would think land, but land, labor, power, many other areas, the factor reforms, how can the state really come in? It's going to be very, very critical. And the other point, which was Mr. Kant's point, amongst the many points that Mr. Kant raised, specifically like your response to it, is anything preventing the state governments from really building up these strong municipal local bodies? This was discussed a little earlier. And when we really look at such urban centers developing, and when agriculture gets lower, the type of share that it has and it will continue to have, what's preventing it is, why can't it happen? So I'll stop there. I'll come back with questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as Mr. Amitabh Kant rightly pointed out, our states are bigger than some of the nations around the world. Take Odisha. Our population is, I think, 48 million, which is like Spain's population. Our area is 1,55,000 square kilometer, which is the area of Bangladesh. So each state in itself is like a nation, a big nation. The fact remains that if India has to achieve its goals for Viksit Bharat, the states have to perform. That goes without saying. And it's not such a difficult thing if you look around globally. Country after country has done that. Some were worse than us in terms of education and health outcomes many years back, in terms of poverty, maybe better in education, but in others they were behind us. But they have transformed. And so what I want to say is it's not difficult to change. Having said that, coming from Odisha, the state is growing at a rate of, let's say, around 8% in real terms every year, which means that even if you go business as usual, we can do it. So 10% or 11% for a decade or 2 decades should not be too difficult a task. But where does this incremental growth come from? What is the strategy? is something which was pointed out by Mr. Khan about certain areas, and I'm sure about state capacity. Karthik is an expert. He's written a big book on it, which I recommend everybody should read. And he would be talking about that. But from the state's perspective, we still have, let's say, 60% of the population dependent on agriculture, which is marginal small farmers, and the per capita income in the agriculture sector, therefore, is much less than the manufacturer and services. How do we make that shift? That's number one. Number two, can the state, rather than getting into the game of giving subsidies and, distorting markets, can we facilitate innovation and growth? How can the state do that? By cutting down costs on, let's say, common infrastructure, or if there are coordination failures or there are market failures, we can address that. Plus, if you want to engender innovation, then probably some risks which the private sector can't cover. Maybe we can come in that way where those can be covered. That's the second area. Then obviously the basic functions which were pointed out. Ensuring a skilled youth, manpower, good health facilities, good standards of living for people, and let's say law and order are something which these are basic, or let's say essential functions of the state which the state should do. I'll just cite 2 or 3 examples what we foresee in Odisha. You see, we are a state which is very sound financial resources. Because of, why? Because we are one of the most richly endowed with minerals. Coal, iron ore, bauxite, chromite, manganese, even rare earths. So we are well endowed with that. We get royalties, so we are financially very well off. If you want to make investments in CapEx, we would. We are also a gateway to East Asia. We have 3 ports. In fact, Paradeep in the public sector became one of the highest grosser in terms of turnover. We're reaching about 150 million. All the plants which are mineral based, like steel and all, have massive expansion plans. Steel, it's like 40 million, they're going in for 120 millions. We have ports, we have plans for developing that. What I'm saying is basic logistics, infrastructure is a priority for the state. We are investing in it. And how do we would like to slowly move to an area where we will attract industries not because of the subsidies, but because of conducive conditions, which I said would be 2 or 3, and I'll relate it to, factor markets. Very recently, we do engage, and here I would request that organizations like CII, industrial associations, can become a very strong forum for interacting and really going deep into issues and giving feedback to the states. Like we came to know that our laws regarding building laws and all were slightly, it had certain, let's say, issues which were affecting the competitiveness of industries. We went into it, we got reports, we did that. Similarly, in the labor areas, there could be restriction on women working at a certain time, not allowing working women's hostel or working hostels in areas, let's say textile parks and all that. These are little things which one can ease very easily. And obviously, the whole ease of doing business part, we've done the stage 1, we go on to the phase 2 now. How do we move it? And there, I think, a very strong feedback mechanism from the industries is very, very essential. We are also looking at engines of growth, and here's where I will relate to urbanization. We've seen it. In fact, it's a failure. Not exactly a failure, but the kind of professional skills or the manpower or the way we administer municipalities which is required is something which is the state is prioritizing in 2 ways. One is the basic administration, which means improved manpower and skills at the municipalities. But the second is the strategic things. We would be surprised to know that a lot of our growth of small towns is organic. It's not planned. And that's not the way to grow. And therefore, we are thinking of centralizing and having a very professional, engaging professionals as a town planning unit at the state level, which will advise, small units who may not have the financial wherewithal to engage such professional skills, so that we can do that. And the ability to then monetize. The very fact that you put in infrastructure in urban areas, you can also increase the value of land, which itself can create, a virtuous cycle of wealth. That's another area. So we have a big plan on a greater Bhubaneswar region where we do all these kind of a thing. So both strengthening the administration of the municipalities, and secondly, the strategic inputs, town planning, getting professional parties, monetizing, transit-oriented development are some of the areas which we would be working on this thing. But fundamentally, I think our core focus now is employment and growth and the structural transformation which was pointed out. Which means, and that is not going to come from the government itself, it is going to come, if we create a conducive environment for the services sector, for the industry sector, so that they are able to, they flourish and create jobs. So that's very broadly, I think, in a short kind of 2-3 minutes, I've just tried to put across what the state thinking is, but I'll definitely come in later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ahuja. Now, Karthik, before you pick up the mic and touch upon the book, which would take a year for people to read in this audience and come back next year, I didn't want to show the book because people would get frightened by the size of it, but it's very easy reading. It's a very easy reading, but the two earlier speakers, to what they said, and the issue of capacity in the states were referred to, the role of private sector was referred to, and I want to be specific, Kili, at this point in time, want to understand from you, how do you see states developing capacity and also private sector playing a role on two very critical areas which are state subjects, which is education and healthcare? And I'd like you to comment on it because that's going to be a critical area for Viksit Bharat.
Thanks so much. So first of all, I just want to say, the feedback I was giving to CII, I was delighted this session is happening, but next year we should have many more sessions at the state level. Simply, like yesterday I was talking about health and education, but most of the frontline delivery is at the state, right? So most of the development, the next steps that we need as a country are at the state level. And, hence like the one sentence plug in the book is it's called A State-Led Roadmap for Effective Governance, just highlighting the centrality of the state. So coming back to the question itself, so I think we all understand the centrality of human development, that no country can really kind of grow at full potential if 50% of your kids are in primary school and can't read at the end of a 5th standard, or 35% of children are stunted. So this does require government action. So, which is why the centrality of state capacity and building effective public systems. So one way to think about this, the analogy I use, is just like the 1950s ambassador was the metaphor of the Indian economy before liberalization, right? In many ways, that is an appropriate metaphor for the functioning of the Indian state. So we've managed to improve state capacity a lot using technology in areas where you can jump over layers of intermediate officials and get finally to the final beneficiary. But in all of these human intermediated services, education, health, police, courts, these are areas where we have an incredible amount of work to do. So coming to, therefore, state capacity, and I'll come to the private sector point in a moment. See, I think there is no getting away from the centrality of the government in solving these problems, right? Because the private sector is an amazing entity. I love the private sector. I love markets. But the basic problem, the tension, is that the democratic ideal is one person, one vote, whereas the market values citizens on a $1, one vote principle, okay? So the market is going to cater to where there's purchasing power. So you can't rely on the market to solve your bottom, of the economic distribution problem. So that is a government challenge, right? Now, where can the private sector help is really thinking about helping the government with regard to better management, right? Because the core issue here is not money. It is, when we say governance, it's basically management, right? So the principles of effective state capacity that I'm talking about in the book are basically management 101 in the private sector, right? So there are these chapters on data and outcome measurement. There's personnel management, there's public finance and revenue. So any CFO, any kind of COO knows that to run an organization, you need your data, you need effective personnel policies, you need to allocate your budgets appropriately, you need to leverage markets well. So those principles of management thinking about how do you diffuse them into the government, that is where the biggest leverage is, right? Because I think even for philanthropy and CSR, it's useful to distinguish between what I call traditional additive philanthropy, right? Which is CSR comes and builds a school or builds a hospital, okay? Now, the government spends 7.5 lakh crores a year on education, okay? So even if you spend 1,000 crores of CSR money to build one more university, that is rounding error in the grand scheme of things. It's less than 1%, okay? But if you can use that 1,000 crores of CSR money to improve the effectiveness of the government by even 1%, then that is a 75x ROI on that money because of the sheer scale of the government, right? So then the question is, how can you start thinking about strategic philanthropy, whereby we start bringing in some of these private sector competences into better management? And that's a hard problem, okay? But I think Niti Aayog, for example, I'll give you a very concrete research-based example, okay? So research-based example, is, see, the research shows that personalized education technology can be incredibly effective at improving learning outcomes, okay? Now, the problem is, in the government, when you try to do ed tech, the government has to procure on a standardized contract and doesn't know how to procure for outcomes. So the procurement will basically be, let's get an L1 and get a bunch of computers in a bunch of schools, and what the research shows is simply giving computers to schools has no impact, okay? Because it doesn't get used, and you really need kind of a fully integrated operator who's thinking about how am I going to use the technology to improve outcomes, okay? So one of the pilots that I think Niti Aayog has put together with support from some CSR is to help governments write outcome-based contracts, okay, whereby you are using the government budget for the computers, but government is not able to pay on results, but then you're using philanthropic capital to pay on results, and therefore trying to incentivize the ecosystem to function for better outcomes. So that's just one example, but it's useful to remember Manish Sabharwal's great kind of, classification, where he said the government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and civil society has a scale deficit, right? So the government has legitimacy and scale, but often has weaknesses in management and execution. The private sector can execute at scale, but because you function on a profit motive, you're not trusted as much. And civil society can often do pockets of excellence, but can't scale because they don't have a revenue model. You have neither taxes nor revenue, okay? So what we need is to then think about how do you leverage the strengths of these three actors to come together and use the government for scale and use, civil society in some ways for innovation, and private capital and industry to then, think about how do you scale those ideas within the government. So we can talk a lot more, but hopefully that example is
So I'll put it this way. I'll put three questions now for all the three panelists. Not any one attributed to anyone. I'll start with myself, and then I'll bring two other people. One is, we talked about capacity, we talked about prudence, we talked about, I have seen, or all of us have seen, Bimaru states, which we knew as Bimaru states, have transformed themselves. And there are new Bimaru states, some of which was referred to by Mr. Khan, which has probably come up. Now, obviously, prudence has played a lot of a part there. And when we look at allocation of resources, prudent allocation of resources, be it in education, healthcare, or for that matter, anything else, is the state of state finances. And that's a situation which needs a lot of attention. And some of it has happened because, probably because of prudence, and some of it has become because we have an election almost every few months in India, and there are compulsions because of that. I'd like to hear views on that, but that's the question number one. But I'll turn to the audience for two questions and open it up together. One of them, as I see, is sitting in the far corner, Dr. Naushad Forbes, who examines economies and economies of states very critically. And second, the issue of technology, and Niti Aayog was mentioned several times by Murli, by Karthik, pretty many times. And I'll bring in Debjani Ghosh, who is now with Niti, to pose any questions. Sorry for those surprise items in terms of the people whom I'm asking to ask questions. Naushad.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandrajit. And my apologies because I'll have to go off very soon because I have the speakers for the next session who I have to go and meet. So the question actually relates to human capital and the point that Karthik just made as well. And I wonder if we could do only one thing. This was a question that was asked in the human capital panel yesterday, and I thought it was a very good question. If we could do only one thing to really improve education outcomes, what would that one thing be? And it would be really interesting to hear each, at the state level overall, at the particular area that you specialize in, and of course, Amitabh, his interests range very broadly and his experience ranges even more broadly.
Jenny? Mike, please, yeah.
Thank you, CB, for always putting us on the spot. But my question is more from a tech lens, which is the biggest enemy of technology deployment at scale is silos, especially in the world of AI, where data is the currency, and the more silos you create, the less effective you get. In this kind of a scenario, what's the balance between states and center? Because if you build state-specific strategies, again you're building silos. But healthcare, agriculture, we benefit from national data sets. So how do we best meet this balance?
So I leave it to whoever wants to go first. Mr. Amitav Kant.
So first and foremost, I don't think the problem is resource and allocation and money. And the more we get into money, the worse it will be. We must realize that there is a failure of governance. There's a failure of governance, and the failure of governance is that we are not clear about the outcomes we want to achieve. We believe in working on financial achievements, that I have to use so much of money and hence I'll finish it by March or May or whatever. But we are not, using that money, we don't achieve that outcomes. And that's simply because we've never worked with data. And I've been a long-term believer. My experience is that of both ease of doing business, creating competition among states, and aspirational district program. We were able to transform 112 districts of India simply because we were getting data on a real-time basis. We were making the districts compete and put that data in public domain. Every collector knew, every MLA knew, every MP knew whether his district is improving or going backward. So put that data in public domain. That was not possible when I was a collector. Data used to come 6 years back after you had left the district. But today you get it on real-time basis. Now put that data out and tell them that whether they are going up incrementally or going backward, name and shame them. Every district of India must be named and shamed. Every state of India must be named and shamed on performance. So data is key. That will improve governance. Don't go with unnecessary issues of we need more money, we need more finance. No, it's not about money. It's about the failure of governance. It's the failure to access data and putting it out in public domain and naming and shaming those who do not perform. And those who do not perform, they must be made an example of, saying that you have failed to deliver here. That, to my mind, is key. The second, and therefore, I'm a believer in data. And data is the only way you will help to improve outcomes. And India needs to improve outcomes. But on issues of education and health, because we are a large country, we are a 1.4 billion people, you need to improve learning outcomes across subjects. Across subjects, if you do not, your learning outcomes are very, very, very poor. You need to improve them sharply. And I'm a great believer in technology. Today, it's possible for us on a minute-to-minute basis, put out that the students use the power of artificial intelligence and tell the students that you conduct tests on a regular basis. These are slow-moving indicators. Education is a slow-moving indicator. Health is a slow-moving indicator. But if you are constantly taking tests on a month-to-month basis on an outcome and putting it out in public domain and using the power of artificial intelligence, you'll be able to say whether this student has moved up in education, this student has moved up in maths, in physics, in chemistry, in history, they've moved up or down or not. Put that for the state, entire state, out in public domain. And then you will force the teacher. The teachers are not teaching, they are not working on outcomes, and the students are failing to deliver. But if you put that data out on a month-to-month basis, whether the student has moved from 40 marks to 45 marks or not, 50 marks or not, then you are shaming the teacher. The teacher will be forced to come, the teacher will be forced to teach, the teacher, the parent, the student, all will combine to improve the learning outcome. Use the power of technology. That is, to my mind, the key.
So technology, transparency, leading to that transformation. So Karthik wants to go first and before the Chief Secretary. Whichever way, yeah, Karthik,
Yeah, no, I'm
go
just
ahead.
picking up on all three sets of questions. I think on the public finance, see, on state public finances, at one level, I think because there's the RBI mechanism and there are limits on borrowing, one of the interesting things is even though states' actual fiscal health varies a lot, the bond market spread is not that high across states' borrowing rates, and that reflects the RBI mechanism whereby the debt is senior. So I think I'm not worried so much about the sustainability of the debt. What I do think is important to focus on is the quality of the expenditure, right? And so it's not the level. We look at sustainability of kind of the macro fiscal level, and quality is not just saying capex is good, revenue X is bad. I think that's kind of too crude, right? So you really need to look at the details of the expense, and one of the frameworks I talk about is you can look at every major spending item through a lens of both equity and efficiency. So, even with welfare schemes, okay, so it's not correct to call all of them freebies because there are some welfare schemes that actually improve productivity, but there are others that actually hurt, okay? So the details really matter. I think coming to then Naushad's question, so here's the bad news and the good news. Okay, the bad news is there is no silver bullet, right? So I think it's a mistake to say what's the one thing, because if you are a CEO running a company, the company can fail for many, many, many reasons. You can fail for bad product, for bad finance, for bad marketing, for bad, so like any healthy organization needs a lot of things to come together, right? So which is why building effective public systems is not a silver bullet. So I fully agree, for example, on data, but one of the reasons data then doesn't translate into accountability is people are transferred every 12 months. And so who are you going to hold accountable, right? So there is this interplay between the data, the personnel, the performance measurement, the performance management, so that requires, again, a systems view on how do you make public systems work better. So I think it's important to recognize there is no silver bullet, but it's not like undoable. It is not rocket science, right? It just requires systematic focus on what is important as opposed to just what's urgent. Now, that being said, Naushad, I will give you good news of one thing. If you said what is one thing that I think based on evidence is immediately scalable, at least over the next 5 years, is the evidence shows that putting an extra Anganwadi worker focused on preschool education could be one of the highest impact ROI investments we can make as a country, because the early childhood, everything is brain development, cognitive function, so much happens in that early stage. And Indian ICDS is the largest early childhood care system in the world, caters to 80 million children, but it's staffed with one worker who's handling everything from preschool education to maternal counseling to nutrition to filling 14 different records. So if you just look at the time used, we've done this large-scale study in Tamil Nadu where you put an extra worker focusing on preschool education, and with a randomized control trial, we find that not only did this dramatically improve learning, we also got substantial reduction in malnutrition because you were saving the time of the existing worker to focus more on health. So if there is one thing that I think will help with both health, education, female labor force participation, creating role model effects by increasing jobs for women in rural communities, I think that would be as close to an evidence-backed simple thing that I would say we could scale. I think to Debjani's last point, again, I couldn't agree more, but what I want to highlight, though, is this is where, when we talk about taking the nation to get forward together, we really need to be thoughtful about harmonizing central and state initiatives, okay? And so what we start seeing in many cases, and I've seen this in states, right, where there are well-intentioned central efforts to collect data, okay, but that data system doesn't accommodate state-level schemes, and so the state will be running its own system to capture its own data, and I've often seen that the poor frontline worker is now expected to fill data in two systems. And if you do the time use, you're actually making things worse. So thinking there about saying, here is the data we need at the national level. Why can't you have an API to grab that data so that you can build that on top of a state system as opposed to duplicating? So I think in government, there is a lot of technology initiatives, but there's not enough product thinking, okay? So you get a very large number of white elephant tech projects that are procured IT systems, and then the person who procured it is gone by the time the system is done. So a lot of the offline processes are then moved online. So you need to then think through the process flow re-engineering with the technology to get to full potential. So again, there are no silver bullets, right? But there is no escaping getting into the details. But that being said, coming back to first principles of federalism, the functions that benefit from scale should sit at the national level. The functions that need to customize locally need to sit locally. And you need to build architectures that both leverage the scale and allow that customization. And that's the principle, but that requires a lot of thinking on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. While we are sitting here talking, it also, the position I am in, we or others are, we also wear two hats. So as I am speaking, logically the question arises, why aren't you doing it? I mean, it's an ask from everybody. There's no political dispensation in the country or in the states who stops you from doing this, broadly, who don't want development. And there's been a fundamental change in the country in the sense that people have started rewarding, even electorally, good governance. So I'll say that at least there's no, there's a compatibility of thought and incentives in terms of what you have to do. Right now, the systems we have, there are legacy issues, but the fact is, and the shift we have to do, if you ask me how our activity is done, I would still say maybe there's a preponderance of personality-driven rather than systemic-driven results, which means that there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of, let's say, dependence on persons rather than systems. And if I have never calculated it, but if I can put it, the ratio of personality-driven as an average across the country to systems would be 60-40. I think we need to shift to something like a 90% substance and 10% personality in terms of governance. That's the largest shift we want to make. Finances, at least our state is well off, but two fundamental issues which I just wanted to raise. One is, yes, we don't have as a state a system or the capacity to undertake a quality of expenditure study. Does this extra money go into capex? Does it go there? Does it go into this scheme? Does it go into education? What is the marginal return? And I think that's something which will help state governments. And it's a very useful thing. Second, there are certain, let's say, democratic compulsions and some commitment devices in things like that. For example, you have the FRBM. Devices like that can help in terms of long-term management of prudent fiscal management or management of resources. And I'll use technology to give an example between how states and central can work together. The DPI, the digital public infrastructure we talk about, we've all heard of UPI. Now, no state has to work on it. No bank has to develop its own this thing. No wallet wala has to develop his whole thing. It's all standardized, it's centralized, it's made, there are protocols, there are standards, and it becomes so easy for people to come into it. And I think that architecture is so good that it can be used as something for IT, things like that, whatever you want to do. So, and here, the good part of it is that while you do things like standards and all can be done centrally at a common level so that everybody doesn't have to work on it, the states have their autonomy because it's a federated kind of an architecture. So you have your data, you customize, you can do things on that. Plus, since it's available, people can innovate on that. And there are so many examples the country has shown. UPI is such a prime example. It's gone international. It's been there. It's doing in agriculture. It started. Health, it's there. Education, it's there. So I think that actually defines a good systemic approach. Otherwise, you had hundreds of people working on, like you mentioned, ma'am, about silos, about data being there, not of a standard, not talking to each other. Half the time we are spending on that, and there's no point. But if you can have, you will bring in efficiency, you will ensure just by design that everything is interoperable and we can talk. While this is done centrally, the states play a role and you can innovate and you have your autonomy and federation, a federated this thing. The third thing I'd like to point about is, yes, capacity of human resources, like when we discuss technology, when we talk about AI, or let's say talk about green hydrogen, or let's talk about semiconductors, we find that the general knowledge which is available in the bureaucracy, in the governance is not, the gap between that and the knowledge frontier is, I would say, needs to be bridged. How we do it, what we do it is there, because ultimately the decision making has to be done at a level. One can't do it, one can't do suboptimal decision making if you don't do that. I think that's one common area where we need to work. How do we do it? How do we bring it about so that that decision making does? Coming to education, which was raised, I think two fundamental things where we can focus on. Karthik is an expert, he's been working in that area. But that foundation and literacy and numeracy, that's one area where it's there in the new education policy. It can make a fundamental difference at the right age to people if we can crack that, improve that ability so that in future they improve. And the second thing which I would like to quote an example from Orissa is with ITS Singapore, we set up a World Skilling Center. Now this is, and here I would say that what's necessary for Viksit Bharat is a change from a domestic mindset to a global mindset. A growth mindset, but a global mindset, where we take, our thought, our processes, our systems should be of a level that we are able to compete globally. Just to give you a small example of this World Skill Center, we did it with ITS Singapore, so it's not like our ITIs, not like that. They came in, they've taken our faculty, they've gone to the ITIs, but it's designed for a very higher level of skills, where there is a huge demand, like escalators, like mechatronics, fields like that. We are planning to bring in, because India is going to invest in semiconductor skills in that. And that has had a ripple effect down the line. So I think why I am saying this is because in education, along with FLN, I think it's very important, the graduates who are coming out of our universities or ITIs, it's important that they get jobs with good wage rates. And that will only come when there's a market demand for that. And for that, it may not be local, but I think for the next decades with the demographic dividend, we should think global. I have seen advertisements, government of Norway, government of Germany, advertisements where I think it was mentioned about 85,000 euros for basic skills, if you know that language. So I think there's a lot, since we have surplus, let's say manpower, that could be one way, increasing our remittances, just one way, a pathway as we move out of poverty. So in education, I think getting skilling linked to the market and the shift in the education sector broadly, and for the primary, below primary level, the FLN approach would pay dividends, I think. Thank you.
I think I must appreciate that phenomenal center built up in Orissa on skills, and seen it very closely and really admired the way ITE and Orissa's collaborated to make that happen and happen so well. And that really talks about how global excellence can be achieved even at the state level, and so much necessary. And I'd really like to invite the panel's views on that global excellence and that aspiration of states at some point in time. But I want to also change a little bit of the discussion to an area, and remember Karthik from your fraternity, another gentleman, well known, Michael Porter, who had talked about competitive advantage, right? And now today we have most of our states wanting to be involved in, from safety pins to rocket launcher, everything, manufacturing all over. I don't know how do you see that? Like your comments on that, and unless we are really focused on what is the competitive advantage of that state, pursue it. Here's a man sitting who started God's own country, and look at the way the results came over there. But have we botched it up, or have we taken forward, is something up for judgment. The second aspect, is been, we spoke about fiscal and we've seen a huge infrastructure build up in India. Again, Mr. Kant was, I remember working with him even when he started the DMIDC project, and we have seen phenomenal national level connect and infrastructure build up. Are the states investing into that last mile or that state level infrastructure spend, which is so critical and important, which will then help them move away from that subsidy-based attraction and be prudent again. And my last point is really, we had seen a very successful reform in India, the tax reform through the GST. That's where all states participated, folded in to look at things together. Can it really be taken forward in ways like in the factor markets, as we had discussed a little earlier? Why can't there be GST-like councils for labor, for agriculture, for power? I want to leave these questions for the panel, but let me be democratic and see if there are two very short, quick questions. There could be a mic quickly over here, please.
We have certain leakages. One is we are spending a huge amount on the prisoners. So we are spending big amount on an individual prisoner, which is more than the minimum wages of skilled in a particular state. Second, re-employment is creating unemployment in certain areas, and the gap between rich and poor is increasing day by day. So what steps or measures we have taken to remove the same or to reduce it?
Right. I'll have the Chief Secretary first. Karthik second, and then wrap it up with the Sherpa.
You know, on the issues which you mentioned about Michael Porter and the competitive, what is that, strategy of nations or competitive of nations? I think the example you talked about, tourism in Kerala, is something where the government in a way stepped in with the private sector and created comparative advantage. And that's the point I am making. For example, today, if I sit in Odisha, I would say that if you take tourism, we are no less endowed than Kerala. But it may be issues like basic hygienic standards, or maybe we just have one or two places, or there are some, you know, things missing, which doesn't make it viable for the private sector perhaps to come in at that level. So what the government needs to do, and I think that's very fundamental to governance also, but how can we look at these areas, pick up these areas, and create that advantage? And that is a part of good governance, but I think that's fundamentally, and that's right up in the radar for the state of Odisha, picking up these areas, finding out what has to be done, and doing that. And I think once the private sector comes in, it will grow up on its own. You also mentioned about things like GST. I think that's a very good idea. If reforms have to be done, and if we take a decade to do them, it's an opportunity cost. We've lost so much in terms of money, in terms of GDP and all. And being a democratic country, I think consensus or cooperative federalism plays a very important role. The GST has given us a very good model, an institutional model, where we can bring disagreements or different viewpoints on a common forum and then move ahead. Then there's a buy-in from everybody. I think that's a very good suggestion, and the point still remains that how do we accelerate reforms? There is something with the central government, something with the state government, and like I said, the necessity, if we all agree this has to be done for growth, then the quicker we do it, the better. We need an institutional mechanism, and these councils are there for that. The issue which you raised about prisoners and inequality, and the third point was? Yeah, re-employment. You see, if you see our population, fundamentally, there's going to be a lot of churning in terms of people moving from one sector to another, somebody getting re-employment, getting out of the market. But the fact is that you should have a basic number of jobs, a growing economy, which creates those jobs. And that can be done. You know, these micro issues would always be there. I mean, you can't control it. Maybe you can have welfare nets. But beyond that, the government can't. Our job is to, like I said, facilitate growth to the extent possible where the private sector comes in and they create. So jobs are created. So like plants will close down, factories will close down, they'll be churning there. Prisoners, I'm not very much aware, but we also answer the Supreme Court where they say, look after the prisoners very well. So, you know, maybe it's a cost. I mean, that's a law and order issue. There can be ways where we have a state which works in a manner, less criminals are there. I mean, there are bigger issues involved in that. I wouldn't like to really go into it. Inequality, yes, it's an issue, and I think the state should be concerned. How do we do it? And you would find that a lot of states have put in welfare measures, and they bring in equity in many ways, in many interventions which are made to address this issue. So the governments are well aware, and I think the democratic process itself also, you know, electoral, this thing also makes it that the states do give focus on equality as a part of their growth strategy.
Thank you. So I'll just make, just picking up on Chandrajit's points. So on comparative advantage, see, I think I have a slightly different view in the following way, right? Which is, I think too much of our focus on the jobs and productivity agenda focuses on sectors, okay? Which is what sectors should we focus on? I think we will do better as a country to focus on what are the frictions that are common to all sectors and all companies, right? So, because the truth is that, comparative advantage matters on the margin, okay? But when your cost of doing business with regulatory cholesterol, with our law, so I'll give you a very simple, powerful study recently, right? So a PhD student at UC Berkeley did a study on district court backlogs in India and estimated that every extra district court judge is able to clear another 200 cases a year. But importantly, 60 to 70% of those cases are land and credit, okay? So these are factors of production that are locked up without being used. And so she estimates that the total increase in economic activity activity is about 30 times the cost of that judge. And the increase in the tax revenue is 6 times just from the GST. So that's an example of such low-hanging fruit that is going to help every sector. Okay, so personally, I get nervous when we talk too much about sectoral prioritization, because that's also a backdoor entry for lobbying for that particular sector. So I would like governments to think much more about frictions and how do we improve kind of ease of doing business for every sector. Okay, so, and there are metrics you can track, right? You can track kind of court cases, you can track outstanding payments. So one of the ironies is often the government is the biggest kind of late payer in terms of causing cost of working capital. On the other side, you have credit schemes through MSMEs. So, you know, you're giving out money, like, you know, but you could solve that more effectively by just kind of solving these frictions. So I think one of the things I talk about, and the other problem which has been referred to by Debjani as well, is how much government, however well-intentioned you are, works in silos, okay? And so the job creation agenda is really something that requires an all-of-government integrated view that is tracking certain key metrics of underlying frictions, and I think that's going to be a more productive way to kind of, you know, move the country forward, because that's one point. Second point is, in terms of just this kind of last mile and connectivity and infrastructure, again, I think we are such a large country that there's benefits and economies of scale from certain national frameworks, but you really want to kind of optimize locally. So I'll give you an example where I think we're slightly kind of going off first best. I don't think we need 50 metro systems, okay, in like tier 2 and tier 3 cities, because urban planning estimates are very clear that the metro locks you in, okay? So in a growth phase, you're much better doing buses, because the buses are much more flexible. So that's then an example of how do you build out that last mile connectivity in a way that's both cost effective and flexible. So but because it's a shiny thing and every state wants its few metros, and then you distribute that. So those are then examples again of how you want to put cost effectiveness, bring in that discipline of estimating the return on investment and allocating capital that way. But yeah, and the last point is, I was just going to say, I think states are still competing too much based on incentives, and that's a zero-sum game, because the companies are also smart and going around shopping for who will give them the biggest incentive, but that's going from the taxpayer to the shareholder. Now, in some cases, there are positive spillovers if you bring a marquee Apple or, you know, and then you get a supply chain ecosystem, so it makes sense. But for the most part, I would really urge both states and industry, right? So CII working groups should be really looking at frictions and giving state governments a list of saying, here is the menu of what you can do, and then focus at the state. The last point I do want to make, sorry, going to the GST example, I would actually argue the opposite way, okay, which is GST needed nationwide coordination because you were trying to create a single market. Okay? There are a lot more reforms that we should actually encourage more local experimentation rather than wait for national consensus, right? Because the way the Chinese reform was make it reduce because you're doing much more procurement from some states. So if you want to get the structural transformation and get people out of agriculture, then you need to say that this MSP structure was put in place in the 1960s when we cared about food security, but it's kind of outlived its utility from a structural transformation perspective. But you can't start that conversation if it is seen as taking away a benefit, right? So then you need, where the GST example I think is relevant, is these complex reforms, you need to get the economics right, you need to get the politics right, and you need to get the trust right, okay? So the GST process I think is very useful as a template for how did you get people, how did you hear all the concerns, how did you navigate, and then how did you build the trust by having a constitutional amendment that guaranteed a certain amount of revenue growth, right? So that I think is a useful model. If tomorrow the GOI wants to look at its procurement bill and saying which are the states that are disproportionately benefiting from this, and I want to reform this, you want to keep it fiscally neutral, okay? It's not about saving money, it's about getting the prices right to accelerate the structural transformation, and I think the GST example gives us a good template for how do you kind of get the economics, the politics, and the trust correct for complex reforms.
Thank you. So the last word to you, Mr. Kant.
No, first of all, I think this has been a fascinating session because Manoj has brought in a lot of his perspective from the state level, and he's worked in Government of India as Agriculture Secretary. So he has a very good perspective of the center and the state. And Karthik has been a great academician who's looked at outcomes and data and produced a great book. So I think we've all benefited. I'll just touch upon 3 or 4 key issues. One is that last mile is critical. You know, when I took over as Secretary Tourism, our before me, the model was of what Haryana had done in tourism, and Mr. S.K. Mishra had done a lot of great work in tourism, and he had created resorts in Haryana by names of birds, guest houses, lakes, etc., all were created. This was state-driven model. The minute Mr. S.K. Mishra left, and he was one of the most outstanding officers, the politicians and bureaucrats just captured those guest houses for booking. So, and when I became tourism secretary in Kerala, for me it was a punishment posting. You know, nobody ever traveled to Kerala. It was not known as a tourism destination. I had fought with the state government. I was without a posting for 10 months. The state said this is the worst posting that can be given to this officer. But my view was very clear that tourism is a private sector activity. All houseboats, all resorts, everything must be done by the private sector. But the last mile, that is the jetties, the roads to those jetties, the access to resorts must be provided by the state government. And the marketing of the destination must be the state government, but with private sector participation. So the last mile was provided by us, and that enabled us, Kerala, to take off as a tourism destination. And therefore, last mile by the state is critical for private sector to take off. But allow the private sector to grow and flourish. Long-term success of any enterprise is possible only and only with the private sector. The government can't do business. That must be clear to all of us. The second point I want to make is that, and I'm making this point about private sector because states keep getting into areas which should be driven by the private sector. The second point I want to make is that at $4 trillion economy, we've reached a stage of growth where whatever we do, and this point was made by Manoj, whatever we do has to be world class. No second class work. Now, to do world class work, this requires good planning. This requires bringing in the best planners. This requires us to bring in detailed engineering before we crack the work. That's tough work. Getting world-class planning, doing detailed engineering on drainage, sewage, solid waste, all that to world-class level requires a lot of hard work. But that adds about 40 to 50% of the value of the project to my mind, and that gives you longevity of the project and brings you on world-class power. It's very important that we focus on growth. And, you know, very few countries have been able to grow at high rates. If you want to be a $30 trillion economy, you need to grow at 9% plus for the next 3 decades. Now, 9% plus for 3 decades has only been achieved by 3 countries: Japan, Korea, and China in recent times. All other countries have fallen in the middle income trap. Now, to grow at that level will require a lot of structural reforms. It will require clarity of that private sectors to drive growth. And thirdly, that there has to be ease of doing regulatory reforms of a very large type, including in regulatory bodies. Now, if you are able to grow at that stage, the democratic polity of India will ensure that this is inclusive growth. Have no doubt in this, that politicians will not be able to come back to power without inclusive growth. I mean, like every election, you are seeing women, schemes for women. And for the first time, elections are being won because of schemes for women. So the labor participation ratio of India has jumped up from 27% to 42% because there's a huge focus on women and Prime Minister's focus on women-led development. The politicians will ensure inclusive growth, balanced growth, if we are able to grow at high rates. And therefore, our emphasis must be to achieve the goals the Prime Minister has set out, that from $4 trillion, we must go on to become a $30 trillion economy, and therefore growth is necessary and it's critical for India, and that India must be able to achieve this vision of being a developed economy by 2047. And without that, we'll neither have growth nor will we be inclusive. We can't be distributing poverty. We have to distribute growth, and therefore growth has to be the key factor. Thank you very much.
So as we close this session, the key takeaways, lots of inputs, lots of work to do, both by the state governments, by institutions like us and others. So the key points being trust two ways, trust and partnership between the business, the government, and the civil society, building world-class, being world-class for any facet that was really discussed, cooperative and competitive federalism, which our Prime Minister had talked about quite some time back. That's one key to for the success and growth and inclusive growth, which will automatically have reforms built in it for Viksit Bharat 2047. May I really thank you, the panelists, Mr. Amitabh Kant, Mr. Manoj Ahuja, Dr. Kartik Muralidharan, for giving us such great inputs and great thoughts on how we can move forward on this very important subject. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panelists very warmly.
Thank you, CB. CB, can I request you to hand over a token of appreciation to all our esteemed panelists, please? Thank you very much.